Chapter 11 Kirill. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Malyshenko, looking puzzled, followed Seriosha out of the car, he was instantly floored by what he saw. The T-34-76 command tank, number 177, had a bizarre modification. The cracked mantlet armor near the right side of the gun, previously damaged by German shells, was gone. In its place was a crudely welded piece of black metal, sticking out like a sore thumb. After a long moment of stunned silence, Malyshenko shook his head, jumped onto the tank, and started inspecting the mantlet. After a while, he finally understood what had happened to his T-34. When Malyshenko's damaged tank needed repairs, the request went to the 20th Tank Division's Field Maintenance Battalion. Known for their typically bold and rough-around-the-edges approach, the Soviet mechanics came up with a solution that was both simple and crude. Since the gun mantlet armor was busted, why not just weld a new piece of armor over it? Problem solved. The Soviet mechanics, having completed the quick and dirty field repair, seemed pleased with their handiwork. After all, the Soviet army during wartime prioritized efficiency and resourcefulness. Saving on materials, time, manpower, these guys deserved a pat on the back for their quick work. However, this slapdash, superficial fix was clearly not appreciated by the customer. Just look at Malyshenko's disgusted face and Liao Xiang's sad expression. The once mighty T-34-76, now sporting this welded-on plate, looked like a pirate wearing a ridiculous eye patch. It was awkward and stifling, to say the least. Malyshenko had heard that Soviet equipment was often clunky and overbuilt, and he knew that this piece of welded armor wouldn't really hurt the tank's fighting ability. Still, seeing his newly acquired ride, which he hadn't even had time to break in, butchered like this, was like someone taking a knife to the paint job of his brand new Porsche. It was a real gut punch. Oh, well, what's done is done. I can't see it from inside anyway. Maybe it'll scare those German guys, he muttered, trying to find a silver lining. Just as Malyshenko was sighing and attempting some mental gymnastics, a hurried voice interrupted his thoughts. Comrade Lieutenant, I'm Kirill Antonov, the new loader assigned to your crew by Commissar Petrov. Reporting for duty. I wish you good health. Huh. New loader. Malyshenko turned toward the voice and saw a blond, blue-eyed kid, a Slav with a clean part in his hair, looking incredibly young. The kid looked more like a college student than a Red Army soldier. Malyshenko stared at him for a long moment. Kirill, young and inexperienced, started to think he'd done something wrong. Finally, Malyshenko, feeling a bit irritated, spoke in a clipped tone. All right, kid. How old are you? Kirill, startled and a little nervous, answered immediately, 20, sir. 20 years old. Ha! Malyshenko shook his head, a bit amused by the frail-looking kid in front of him. Since Commissar Petrov sent you, I don't have a problem with it. But I need to ask you a few questions, just to make sure we don't have any problems when we go into battle. He brushed the dust off his uniform from climbing on the tank, not really paying attention to Kirill's reaction. The tank behind me is the most powerful medium tank in the Red Army right now, the T-34. The turret has an F-34 76mm gun. One armor-piercing round from this baby is all it takes to send those German tin cans to hell. Kirill listened intently, hanging on every word, eager to prove himself in his new job. But, Malyshenko continued, all of that depends on having a loader who can quickly and efficiently slam those shells into the breach. Each 76mm BR-350B armor-piercing round weighs over 10 pounds. I'm not trying to question your abilities, kid, but are you sure you can keep up your strength in a cramped tank, in the heat of battle, and keep loading those rounds? Kirill fell silent, listening to Malyshenko's blunt assessment. He had never expected to be thrown into a war so soon after leaving school. He had pulled some strings to get this job as a tank loader, but now, Malyshenko's words had shaken him. Before all this, he'd been into music and poetry and barely knew what a tank looked like. Sir. Malyshenko sighed, seeing the boy struggling for words, his face turning red. He reached out and clapped Kirill on the shoulder, softening his tone. I'll give you 10 minutes to think about it. Don't feel pressured. If it's not for you, you can join the infantry and still serve the motherland. The battlefield doesn't need reluctant heroes. Chapter 12 News You Shouldn't Know. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After Malyshenko's words, Kirill just hung his head, silent. He looked like a kid who'd been caught with his hand in a cookie jar by an adult. A scolded child tends to clam up. Malyshenko, recently promoted to captain, saw the scene but didn't have the time to sit down and have a heart-to-heart with a grown man. As company commander, he had more pressing matters. Captain Malyshenko, a soldier announced, I have urgent orders from division and regiment headquarters. You are to assemble your unit within 30 minutes and prepare to move out with the main force. Move it. Malyshenko, caught off guard, asked, move out. What are our objectives? Normally, a company commander like Malyshenko wouldn't inquire about strategic intentions. However, the regimental communications soldier, unusually forthcoming, shared some grim news. Frontline reconnaissance reports indicate a large number of German armored groups are advancing from Lutsk to Brod. Captured prisoners confirm that the German Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Rundstedt, is targeting our 9th Mechanized Army. The 1st Panzer Group, the vanguard of Army Group South, is spearheading the offensive. They've routed several of our units and are pushing towards Kiev, posing a significant threat. Army headquarters has ordered us to stop their advance and protect the city. The soldier snapped the folder shut, saluted sharply, and said, These are our division's combat plans and details Political Commissar Petrov instructed me to relay. Keep this confidential, Comrade Malyshenko. Before Malyshenko could respond, the soldier vanished into the crowd. The news left Malyshenko puzzled. This seems like information I shouldn't even know, much less need to know. Why would Petrov specifically send this message to me? Is there something I'm missing? Is this some kind of setup? Growing up with a healthy dose of Western skepticism about Soviet political officers, Malyshenko felt uneasy around Lieutenant Colonel Petrov. Those political commissars who survived the purges were sharp cookies, and the ones who were good at reading people and spreading propaganda. They were the smartest of the bunch. Petrov was one of those survivors. He might not have been a tactical genius, but when it came to political games, Malyshenko knew he was outmatched. He lived by the motto, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Malyshenko couldn't shake the feeling that Petrov's actions were suspect. What did a division-level political commissar want with him? The situation gave Malyshenko a major headache. Whatever, he muttered. One step at a time. If a big shot like that wants to screw me over, I probably can't stop him. Besides, a German shell could take me out tomorrow, and then who's gonna care? That he climbed back into his T-34 tank, number 177, and started planning. As the newly appointed commander of the 1st Company, things couldn't get much worse. The previous day's counterattack against the German 13th Panzer Division, though initially successful, had cost the Soviet 20th Tank Division dearly. Despite their surprise attack, the tenacious German infantry and tank units inflicted heavy losses. The 1st Tank Company, spearheading the assault, was thrown into the fight immediately upon arrival. The Soviet commanders, fresh out of military school and lacking experience, lacked basic infantry tank coordination skills. They were relying on textbook tactics, but war isn't a textbook exercise. The elite German soldiers of the 13th Panzer Division wouldn't follow the script. The Soviets, ill-prepared and exhausted from their long march, paid a heavy price for their recklessness. Chapter 13 Rebuilding the 1st Company. You are listening at novelfull.audio. According to battle loss reports, the Soviet 20th Tank Division took a beating yesterday. Between charging headfirst into the attack and stretching their supply lines for miles with those crazy refueling tactics, they really paid the price. The vanguard, fresh off the march and barely settled in, was immediately hammered with orders from a stubbornly out-of-touch division HQ, acting straight from the book and echoing commands from higher up. They demanded an immediate assault on German troops holed up in a nearby village. What HQ didn't realize was that those Germans weren't some ragtag group. They were a reinforced battalion from the Wehrmacht's 13th Panzer Division, dug in and ready for a fight. It was mid-1941, and T-34 production hadn't reached the point where they were rolling off the assembly line like they would later in the war. The Western Front, responsible for the defense of the Soviet Union and Europe, had top priority for new equipment, but even the latest T-34/76 model 1941 was a valuable and scarce asset. Captain Brasovsky's company had 17 tanks on paper. But after a long march, Lieutenant Malyshenko's T-34 broke down, leaving 16 tanks ready for the initial attack. Of those 16, only Brasovsky's command tank was a T-34/76. The other 15 were obsolete BT-7 fast tanks and T-26 light tanks. These light tanks were outmatched by the German Panzer III and IV tanks they faced. At best, they were only slightly better than the Panzer I, II, and Czech-built 38T light tanks still in German service. The Soviets' equipment disadvantage couldn't be overcome by a single, superior T-34/76. The speed of the light tanks couldn't be effectively used in the close-quarters battle. The Germans, with their superior numbers, quickly overwhelmed them. Only tank number 177, paralyzed and immobile, remained. If the rest of the 20th Tank Division hadn't arrived and joined the fray, Lin Jie, freshly transported to this battlefield, would have been captured or burned alive inside his tank. After the battle, the 1st Tank Company was devastated. Captain Brasovsky was dead, and the remaining 16 BT-7s and T-26s were destroyed. Other units of the 20th Tank Division suffered significant losses as well. The division's nearly 20% tank loss rate was a major blow to the morale of these Red Army soldiers who had just gone through a purge. It was a brutal introduction to the combat effectiveness of the world's most elite armored forces. The German panzers, having conquered Europe with blitzkrieg tactics, lived up to their reputation. Their equipment was good, but their experience and training were unmatched. The Soviet 20th Tank Division's next challenge, even after their Pyrrhic victory, was reorganization. The 1st Armored Company, virtually wiped out with only T-34 No. 177 remaining, became the focus of Division Commander Chernyshev's attention, wanting this company, which produced one tank hero, to remain a fighting force. Colonel Chernyshев, after consulting with Political Commissar Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, made a decision. The reorganized 1st Armored Company would have 6 T-34 divided by 76s and 11 BT-7 fast tanks, including No. 177, to bring it back to full strength. Reinforcements and new tanks were impossible to get. The new T-34s and BT-7s had to be taken from other units within the 20th Tank Division. It was a desperate wartime measure of robbing Peter to pay Paul, but with experienced crews transferred in, Malyshenko, now in command for less than a day, would no longer be a paper tiger. This was great news for Malyshenko, who was eager to prove himself on the battlefield, earn a promotion, and avoid becoming cannon fodder. After ordering his new company to warm up and prepare to move out, Malyshenko sighed and turned to find Kirill, the kid, squatting silently by a low wall. "Damn war," that he sighed softly, shuffled over to Kirill, and pulled a half-empty pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He offered one to Kirill. "I don't know if you smoke, but I figured this might match your mood right now." Chapter 14 The Scary Uncle. You are listening at novelfull.audio. He looked up, a sheen of tears in his eyes. Malyshenko was surprised. This big kid, fresh out of training, was actually crying. "Oh, well, he's just a greenhorn." He rolled up his sleeve, glancing at the German officer's watch he'd scavenged. With just over 10 minutes before departure, he decided to use the time to talk to the kid. "Here, hold that thought. Smoke this first." Red Army soldiers who smoke fight better. That he coaxed Kirill into taking the cigarette, saying whatever came to mind. He pulled out a lighter fashioned from a 62 by 54 mm rifle shell, flicked the wheel, and lit Kirill's first smoke. Unlike the German and American armies, which issued ready-made cigarettes, the Soviet army provided loose tobacco, cigarette papers, and matches. So, if a Red Army soldier wanted a convenient cigarette to relieve tension during the war, he had to roll his own. Often, in the thick of battle, hygiene went out the window, and Red Army soldiers would hastily mix dust and whatever else was around into their tobacco, without filters. You can imagine how those cigarettes tasted. This rough tobacco, usually beloved by seasoned Soviet smokers, made Kirill cough and choke after just one puff. Tears streamed down his face. Cough, cough, sir, why is this so harsh? Seeing Kirill, half-smoked cigarette in hand, snot and tears running, Malyshenko, who hadn't thought much of him, remembered sneaking his first cigarette in school. Ha, you get used to it. But trust me, Kirill, when you're a real Red Army soldier, you'll love it. But sir, I don't think I'm cut out to be a loader, like you said. I might mess up in battle. I don't want to be a burden to everyone, comrade captain. Looking at Kirill's earnest, worried face, Malyshenko remembered feeling just as unsure of himself. He softened his tone. You know, Kirill, when I was your age, I felt the same way. But my mentor told me something. He said, stand tall, son. Don't let setbacks get you down. No matter where you go, remember one thing. We're men. And heroes don't give up or lose faith. He paused, looking Kirill in the eye, a senior offering strength and encouragement. Now, I want to pass that on to you. Tell me, Kirill, what are we? Hearing those strong words, Kirill's tears turned to a watery smile. Inspired by Malyshenko's spirit, he nodded, wiping his cheeks. Thank you, comrade captain. We're heroes. That's right. Clapping his hands, he stood up. He decided to take the kid on. He yelled towards his T-34, number 177. Seriosha. Nikolai. You two knuckleheads, get over here. I've got something to tell you. Hearing Malyshenko's booming voice, the two, who were warming up the radio inside the tank, hurried over. Come on, let me introduce you. This young comrade is Kirill, and he's our new loader. Kirill, this is Seriosha, our driver. And this is Nikolai, our mechanic and machine gunner. Get to know each other. The four of us are going to be working together to kick some invader butt. Today's the start of our partnership. Seriosha and Nikolai, about the same age as Kirill, immediately welcomed him, peppering him with questions. They were both from ordinary Soviet families and accepted Kirill without hesitation. Hey, Kirill, did they just assign you to our division straight out of training? What armor school did you go to? In the easy back and forth, Seriosha asked a casual question. Kirill, without thinking, told them the truth. I was in the music department at Moscow State University. I just graduated this year. But my family wanted me to be a Red Army soldier like my uncle, so he arranged for me to be sent here. But I'm really happy now, getting to know you guys is great. They exchanged confused glances. Malyshenko, curious, spoke first. Kirill, if you don't mind me asking, who is your uncle? Of course, comrade captain. Smiling, still caught up in the joy of new friendship, Kirill revealed a shocking truth. My uncle is Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, the political commissar and captain of our 20th Tank Division. Chapter 15 War Clouds Gather. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After Kirill dropped that bombshell, the three of them just stared at each other, stunned. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov is Kirill's uncle. Holy cow, Malyshenko was the most shocked. As Kirill's direct superior and commander of tank number 177, he could barely wrap his head around it. After the initial shock wore off, the truth started to sink in. Petrov's vague instructions to the communications guy about our next deployment suddenly made perfect sense. I'm putting my nephew and the next phase of this operation in your hands. You better have a solid plan before we roll out. If Kirill screws up, everyone pays the price. Petrov hadn't said it exactly like that, but Malyshenko, connecting the dots, figured that was the gist of it. Guys like Petrov, a division-level political commissar, didn't spell everything out. That blunt style was ancient history, tossed aside by veterans who'd survived the purges. Instead, they hinted and implied, leaving you to fill in the blanks, which made figuring out their real intentions a total pain. Great, Malyshenko thought, a hot potato I can't drop. At this point, there was no way Malyshenko could pawn Kirill off on someone else. Now, his priority was to guide and protect the new loader, who was so green he was almost cute. Everything else took a back seat to that. With a mix of regret and speculation about Petrov's motives, Malyshenko plastered on a smile and welcomed Kirill, the connected new loader, to the crew. Then, following orders from high command, he led his newly formed armored company towards the front lines, spearheading the entire division's advance. Normally, according to Soviet Western Front training exercises based on possible German invasions, a long-distance armored unit transfer like this, over 120 miles, would be handled by the Soviet Western Military District's rail network. Forcing the troops to cover that kind of distance on their own was a recipe for exhaustion, impacting their combat effectiveness later. Plus, the Soviet Union's underdeveloped road system in the West was a nightmare. While it slowed down German armor, it also made life hell for the Soviet tank divisions, forcing them to endure harsh conditions. Heavy armored vehicles weren't built for cross-country treks. Parts would inevitably break down, vehicles would get stuck, and the 20th Tank Division would arrive at the front line in rough shape. But for Malyshenko's outfit, this grueling self-propelled march was the only option. Before the Barbarossa invasion, the Germans, through espionage and intelligence gathering, had discovered the Soviet plan to use the Western Front's railway network for strategic troop movements. The German General Staff promptly adjusted the invasion plan. The Luftwaffe's first airstrike targeted every railway junction and key point on the Western Military District's rail network. The Stukas and Junkers turned the railway system, vital for the Soviet defense, into a twisted mess of metal and rubble. The destruction of the railroads crippled the Soviet Western Front's troop deployments and defense. They couldn't muster a force to match the Germans, and were forced into a fighting retreat. The destroyed railroads also made deploying reinforcements a logistical nightmare. Sending reinforcements to their units by themselves wasted precious time and raised the question of how much fight they'd have left after such a long journey. Despite this, the Soviet 9th Mechanized Army, tasked with stopping the German Army Group South from reaching Kiev, didn't hesitate. Under Major General Rokossovsky, the 20th Mechanized Army, with its 35th and 35th Tank Divisions and the 131st Motorized Infantry Division, began its 120-mile dash towards the enemy. Under the scorching June sky, a brutal armored battle, pitting steel against flesh, was about to begin. Chapter 16 Death Scream, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After a night spent in a chilly tank reeking of diesel, Malyshenko grabbed a quick bite and immediately ordered his armored company to move out, heading straight for their designated target, the T-34/76 medium tank. An upgrade from the initial 1940 models, boasted a more powerful F-34 76.2 mm gun. However, its clunky design and structural flaws were never addressed. To minimize the turret's exposed area and reduce the chance of getting hit, early T-34/76 tanks featured a cramped, two-man turret. While this design achieved its intended effect, bolstering the tank's frontal defense, the cramped turret had serious drawbacks. With no room for a ready-use ammunition rack, the loader, typically a tall Slavic guy, had to contort himself, reaching down into the hull to retrieve ammunition and then load it into the breech. Furthermore, the tiny turret excluded a dedicated commander, leaving only the gunner and loader. In the heat of battle, the overworked gunner had to scan the battlefield with a wide-angle periscope, then switch to the narrow-angle gun sight to aim and fire. On top of that, he had to take on the commander's responsibilities, issuing orders to the other crew members while simultaneously focusing on firing. It's easy to imagine the challenges this presented in the chaos and rapidly changing environment of combat. Soviet T-34/76 gunners, burdened with multiple tasks, frequently made errors, leading to miscommunication and fatal mistakes. As a result, these tanks often fell victim to German tanks, which had a 5-man crew with a clear division of labor: commander, gunner, loader, radio operator, and driver. The Germans exploited the Soviet tanks' weaknesses with deadly precision. But even more than these battlefield disadvantages, Malyshenko was currently agonizing over the feeling of being trapped in a metal coffin, due to design flaws and a lack of consideration for ergonomics. The heavy, single-piece hatch on the 1941 T-34/76 turret nearly covered the entire top surface. Without modern hydraulic or electric assistance, opening such a massive hatch was a Herculean effort. After what felt like an eternity, Malyshenko finally managed to push the hatch open. He stood up, stretching his upper body out of the turret, and inhaled deeply, savoring the fresh air. Almost 2 days on the road already. I wonder where Rundstedt's Army Group South has broken through. Damn it, can Kiev even be defended? The die is cast, and fighting the Germans is inevitable. I'm just not convinced that among military history buffs, the Kiev encirclement, a colossal battle with the highest number of prisoners ever recorded, is a legendary event. During this battle, a staggering 650,000 out of the 800,000 Soviet troops stationed in Kiev were captured. The German guards assigned to escort the Soviet POWs sometimes consisted of just one squad guarding an entire regiment. Surprisingly, the Soviet prisoners didn't resist, passively submitting to their fate in German POW camps. A significant portion of these captured Soviet soldiers were Ukrainians. Within the Soviet army, friction between Ukrainian and Russian soldiers due to historical issues was common knowledge. It wasn't unusual for Ukrainian soldiers, unwilling to defend Moscow or work for the Russians, to surrender to the German army. Some even joined the Ukrainian Liberation Army to fight alongside the Germans against their former comrades, but Comrade Malyshenko, newly arrived in the world of World War II, had no intention of dying on the battlefield or ending up in a German POW camp playing house with disgruntled Ukrainian soldiers. The thought of participating in a battle destined for defeat filled Malyshenko with dread. He feared being shot by the Germans or enduring the horrors of a POW camp. No, I can't just blindly attack and be used as cannon fodder. If I run into Army Group South, I'll be wiped out before I can even blink. I need to think this through. I have to find a way to survive this mess. Lost in thought, Malyshenko failed to notice the ominous black shadow circling high above him in the clouds. It seemed to be confirming something before vanishing without a trace. About 10 minutes later, as Malyshenko's head began to ache from overthinking, he decided to return to the turret for a rest. Suddenly, the sound of a distant propeller broke the silence. A plane. Damn it, could it be a German plane? Looking towards the source of the sound, Malyshenko saw 6 oddly shaped, black figures, resembling giant gulls, appear on the horizon. Son of a bitch. Stukas. Everyone, stop immediately. Take cover for air defense. Chapter 17 The Scream of Death, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. If the German armored forces were the land-based spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, the Luftwaffe's Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber was undoubtedly its aerial counterpart. Designed and built by Junkers, this low-wing, single-engine dive bomber had secretly undergone battlefield testing during the Spanish Civil War in 1936, proving its worth in combat. Following its success in Spain, the Germans immediately initiated upgrades and developed numerous submodels. The Stuka and the Bf-109 fighter series became known as the 2 most iconic aircraft of the German Air Force. By the time Operation Barbarossa was launched, the Ju-87 Stuka B series variants were widely deployed in frontline units. The latest Ju-87D was also finalized and entering production, poised to further bolster the German Air Force's combat effectiveness. The 6 Stukas diving towards Malyshenko and the Soviet 20th Tank Division weren't specifically targeting him. About 10 minutes prior, these Stukas, freshly refueled and armed at a rear airfield near the Soviet-German border, were simply tasked with relocating to a frontline airfield and awaiting orders. However, just as they approached the German frontline airfield, a new directive from Air Command changed their mission, ordering them to proceed immediately to the front lines. Reconnaissance reports a Soviet mechanized force moving towards Army Group South in the designated area, with an unknown number of tanks and some heavy equipment. You are ordered to intercept and bomb immediately. So, before landing, the 6 Ju-87B, 2 Stukas turned towards Malyshenko's troops just a few kilometers away. As the latest iteration of an existing design, the B-2 Stuka represented the pinnacle of German Air Force technology at the time, earning its terrifying nickname, Screaming Death. The main difference between the Ju-87B-2 and the earlier A model was the Junkers Jumo 211D 12-cylinder inline water-cooled engine, delivering a powerful 1,200 horsepower. This new engine boosted the Stuka's maximum level flight speed from 310 km per hour to 383 km/h. While this speed wasn't exceptional compared to mainstream fighters in 1941, it significantly improved the B-2's payload capacity, besides retaining the two 7.92 mm MG-17 wing-mounted machine guns. The B-2's bomb-carrying capacity increased from 250 kg to 500 kg. It could carry one 250 kg bomb and four smaller 50 kg bombs for ground strikes, if necessary. The B-2 could even carry a massive 1,000 kg bomb against heavily fortified positions, sacrificing the rear gunner and minimizing fuel. This made it a versatile bomber for targeted strikes against large ships. In terms of design, the B-2 retained the automatic dive brakes and the notorious Jericho trumpet from the A model. The automatic dive brakes, still advanced for 1941, gave the Stuka exceptional control. They allowed the heavy Stuka to automatically recover from a dive without manual operation, preventing crashes caused by pilot blackout from high G-forces. The Jericho trumpet used the airflow over the Stuka's body to create a terrifying shriek during dives. This was intended to shock the enemy and instill psychological fear, solidifying the Stuka's reputation as screaming death. At that moment, the 6 B-2 Stukas diving towards Malyshenko's vanguard were configured for standard ground attack, equipped with a 250 kg bomb and four 50 kg bombs. These black-painted birds could easily engage armored targets or unleash smaller bombs for wide-area destruction of softer targets. Being from the future, Malyshenko was well aware of the Stuka's terror. Without adequate air defenses or fighter cover, the Stuka was death incarnate for any ground force. Immediately, Malyshenko leaned out of the turret and shouted to the surrounding vehicles to stop. Because not all vehicles had radios, communication relied on primitive semaphore signals. This lack of proper communication within the Soviet armored forces was about to cause a disaster. While some tank crews near Malyshenko heard his shouts and stopped, others further ahead, deafened by engine noise, continued moving forward. Frantic, Malyshenko was about to jump off his tank and run ahead to warn them. But a piercing shriek from above beat him to it. Chapter 18 The Scream of Death, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Before heading to the brutal Soviet-German battlefields, Malyshenko, a military history buff from a later generation, had endlessly imagined the impact of air raids, but no matter how realistically war movies tried to portray it, or how vividly veterans described the horrors they'd witnessed, the sheer force of the German Stuka dive bombers' payloads far exceeded his expectations. Boom. Explosions ripped through the air, churning up sand and dust. The first 250 kg bomb plummeted from the sky, hitting the Soviet tank convoy dead-on. It erupted into a searing fireball instantly, with an explosive force equivalent to 125 kg of TNT and a 50% charge coefficient. It packed a serious punch. The intense flames, accompanied by concussive air waves, spread outwards from the blast's epicenter like a tidal wave. Several BT-7 light tanks within mere meters of the explosion were instantly reduced to scrap metal. AT-34, slightly further away, didn't fare much better. The shockwave flipped the 28-ton medium tank onto its side. Meanwhile, Malyshenko, who had just jumped off his tank's turret to warn his troops, wasn't spared either. The aerial bomb's surging shockwave caught Malyshenko as he ran, tossing him around like a plastic bag in a hurricane. His 6-foot frame, weighing over 200 pounds, was as insignificant as a scarecrow against the blast. He flew backwards for dozens of yards before slamming into the ground. His condition was unknown. With Malyshenko out of action, the already chaotic Soviet troops crumbled even further under the German air assault. Facing the deadly scream of incoming bombs and watching their comrades fall, the surviving Red Army soldiers, realizing escape was futile, went berserk. With a death-or-glory attitude, they grabbed any weapon they could find and started firing into the sky at the grotesque Stukas. The GAZ AAA anti-aircraft trucks at the rear of the column laid down the most ferocious anti-air fire. Beyond its standard role as a cargo and personnel carrier, this truck was equipped with a quad-mounted 7.62 mm Maxim 1910 M4 anti-aircraft machine gun in the cargo bed. It could elevate to 45 degrees and rotate 360 degrees, providing all-around defense. While a truck armed with 4 Maxim machine guns might seem underpowered, it was the most common and arguably the most effective mobile anti-aircraft weapon available to the Soviet Western Front in the summer of 41. A hail of bullets and crimson tracer rounds ripped through the sky as the Stuka, still diving towards the Soviet troops, swerved to avoid the barrage. The B-2 Stuka dive bomber, only sporting bulletproof plating around the pilot's cockpit, wasn't as robust as later models. A lucky hit from the 7.62mm machine guns could cripple the fragile engine nacelle, causing the plane to crash, a risk the German pilots were unwilling to take. After shaking its heavy frame and climbing to a safer altitude, the German pilot, who had narrowly avoided death, clearly resented the Soviet anti-aircraft guns. Bugs should know their place. It's brave to challenge the sky, but it's stupid. Muttering a curse, he located the Soviet anti-aircraft truck and locked onto it. This hot-headed pilot immediately put his plane into a near-vertical dive, plummeting towards the truck, facing Stukas diving straight down at them. The Red Army soldiers, enthusiastic but poorly trained, panicked. The Maxim machine gun's maximum elevation was only 45 degrees. Even if they maxed out the angle, they couldn't target the German planes. They were in a dead zone, their minds and hearing overwhelmed by the Stuka's scream of death. The soldiers finally broke. Driven by instinct and fear, they abandoned the anti-aircraft gun and ran. Wah! To amplify the psychological impact of Stuka attacks, the Luftwaffe installed a small siren on the tail fin of each bomb. This device, similar to the Jericho trumpet on the plane itself, used airflow to generate a chilling scream as the bomb plummeted to Earth. Combined with the Stuka's own siren, the resulting cacophony was terrifying. Amidst this hellish shriek, the Soviet anti-aircraft truck that had been unleashing its fury was reduced to burning scrap in the blink of an eye. Blown-off tires flew nearly 100 yards, a testament to the explosion's force. For Malyshenko's mixed unit, this was only the beginning of a long nightmare. Chapter 19, Surviving the Catastrophe. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The flames danced and flickered in the wreckage, a devil's tongue licking at the steel and the dead, painting everything red. The Stukas, like vultures circling a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood, still wouldn't leave. Even after dropping all their bombs, they continued to rake the ground with their wing-mounted machine guns. The Soviet troops, caught completely by surprise during their movement, had already suffered terrible losses. Tanks and vehicles were either blown to bits or overturned by the blasts, useless. The infantry, who had been escorting the armor, were shredded, torn apart by shrapnel and bullets. The scene was hell on earth. The Soviet ground troops were struggling, taking horrific casualties under the relentless German air raid. The last pass was completed, and the corpses of the Soviet soldiers, riddled with machine gun fire, lay still, never to rise again. The German Air Fleet commander, clearly pleased with his handiwork, gave the order, and the squadron turned and headed back the way they came, arrogance trailing behind them like exhaust fumes, the Stukas that had been screaming encircling. Overhead for what felt like forever finally turned tail and left after burning through nearly half an hour's worth of fuel. The Soviet soldiers who had somehow survived the aerial assault from hell cautiously emerged from their hiding places and ran toward their comrades, most of whom were already cold, desperate to do what they could. Nearby, the crew of the T-34 tank, miraculously unscathed, were in a frenzy. The fate of Captain Malyshenko, commander of the vanguard, was foremost on everyone's mind. Seriosha, Nikolai, and Kirill, the new loader, these three, who were closest to Malyshenko, scrambled to the edge of a still smoldering crater as soon as the all-clear was sounded. Captain Malyshenko, where are you? Comrade Captain, can you hear us? They refused to believe Malyshenko had been killed in the attack. Shouting his name, they searched among the wreckage and bodies, hoping for a sign, but the scene was a wasteland of twisted steel and burning flesh, and their calls went unanswered. Everywhere, surviving soldiers frantically rescued the wounded and salvaged what supplies and equipment they could. But amidst the unidentifiable remains of men torn apart by bombs and bullets, there was no trace of Captain Malyshenko. That the brutal death of his comrades and the terrifying shriek of the Stukas had already hit Kirill, the young recruit, hard. Only 2 days ago, he had been laughing with the now possibly dead Malyshenko, a man who had seemed so confident, this was the last straw. Kirill, raised on Soviet propaganda and socialist ideals, had never seen such carnage. The apparent loss of Captain Malyshenko shattered his already fragile spirit. This boy, who just a week before had been immersed in organ music, finally collapsed, falling to his knees with a wail, burying his face in his hands and weeping openly. Few paid him much attention. These Red Army soldiers, hardened by the German onslaught, were used to blood and death. They were accustomed to the cries of fresh recruits like Kirill, thrown into the grinder, but after dealing a crushing blow, fate seemed to offer a glimmer of hope. Just as Kirill knelt, lost and weeping, a shout pierced the air, a beacon in the darkness, instantly snapping him back to reality. "Hey! Over here! Captain Malyshenko! He's alive!" Kirill snapped his head up, following the sound. A Red Army soldier, holding a rifle and wearing a helmet, was frantically waving his arms from behind a small rise. Without a word, Kirill scrambled to his feet. Overwhelmed with emotion, he all but crawled toward the soldier, his only thought, "Malyshenko has to be alive." It turned out that when the Stuka dropped its bomb, Malyshenko had been thrown by the blast. By some miracle, he hadn't been hit by shrapnel. The explosion had sent him flying, but fate had intervened once more. He had landed in a muddy haystack, soaked from a recent rain. He was covered in muck, filthy, but the mud and grass had cushioned the impact. He had only been knocked unconscious, escaping serious injury despite being thrown 20-some meters. Cough, cough, cough. This stuff tastes awful. My mouth is full of mud and grass. But with the help of the Red Army soldier who found him, Malyshenko stumbled up from the pit. He could barely speak, his mouth filled with the taste of dirt and vegetation. He grabbed his canteen, poured water over his face, trying to wash away the layer of mud that had completely obscured his features. Chapter 20 Collateral Damage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sitting on a rock nearby, he took the cloth Kirill offered and wiped the mud from his face. Malyshenko, surprised by the speed and intensity of the German air attack, sighed softly. "What are our casualties? Have we counted them yet?" They exchanged glances at his question. Nikolai, the electromechanical tech, finally spoke up. "Comrade, we lost 8 BT-7s and 1 T-34. Another T-34 was flipped by the blast wave and is off the road. We're still counting casualties, but we're estimating total loss of those crews." Malyshenko frowned, suppressing his emotions, his brow twitching. "What about the infantry? What about the company that was with us?" Back in 1941, the Soviets tended to use their armor more as infantry support than as an independent force. In that sense, they were on the same page as the British and Americans, who also saw tanks as mobile gun platforms. This put them a step behind the Germans, who were already masters of blitzkrieg. The fact that the Soviets were using advanced T-34s and KVs to support infantry showed that, outside of Germany, nobody had really grasped the future of armored warfare. A big part of the problem was General Pavlov, the commander of the Western Front. Revered as the godfather of Soviet tanks and trusted by Stalin, Pavlov had been given control of the USSR's main gateway to Europe and its strongest forces. He'd survived the purges, rising to a leadership position in the Armored Corps thanks to Stalin's faith in him, but in charge of the Western Front, this veteran of the Spanish Civil War started going in the wrong direction. Pavlov believed that armor's role was to support infantry, and that future wars would still be decided by infantry and artillery, just like in World War I. Under his command, corps-level armored units in the Western Front were dissolved, leaving only division-level tank units. Pavlov's misguided tactics left the Western Front, even with its superior T-34s and KVs, vulnerable to the German blitzkrieg. Despite having better tanks, the Soviets were outmaneuvered and destroyed. It's no exaggeration to say that Pavlov's poor leadership and flawed vision for armored warfare were major reasons for the Western Front's collapse in the face of Operation Barbarossa. It was Pavlov's flawed thinking that led to Malyshenko's armor being supported by a motorcycle and chemical infantry detachment roughly equal in size to his tank force. To keep up with the tanks, the Soviet infantry rode in trucks or even on the T-34 engine decks, carrying minimal heavy equipment. The Soviet motorized infantry divisions typically had 37mm and 76mm anti-aircraft guns, but because of their size and transportation challenges, they left these behind. All they had were a few Maxim anti-aircraft machine guns mounted on trucks, which proved useless against the Stukas, the densely packed Soviet infantry, riding on tanks and trucks without protection, became prime targets for the German Stukas, between the reigning 50 kg bombs and the Stuka's dual 7.92mm machine guns. The Red Army soldiers were caught completely off guard and suffered heavy casualties in less than half an hour, while Pavlov's view of tanks as auxiliary weapons was a historical blunder. It's undeniably true that tanks need infantry support. It's a symbiotic relationship. Without infantry, tanks are vulnerable to close-range attacks from anti-tank grenades and Molotov cocktails. Conversely, infantry without tank cover are sitting ducks for enemy machine guns and artillery. That's why Malyshenko, barely recovered from the shock, was so concerned about the infantry casualties. If the supporting infantry had taken heavy losses or been wiped out, it would seriously hamper his future operations.